Hi, I'm Natalie Bencivenga, back with a challenge for you to dare to care. With the help of some smart and passionate guests, I hope to interest you in a story or an issue that you may have ignored in the past. Maybe you thought it was happening too far away or it had nothing to do with your everyday life. This show hopes to change that. My second guest in this ongoing series is going to help us understand the power of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and why your vote in this upcoming election really matters and why you should care. Jerry, I am so glad to have you here and to talk about all of the things surrounding the state Supreme Court. I have a feeling that people may not know that much about what a state Supreme Court actually is and what it does. So, can you just take us back to basics and start right there?
Yeah, sure. Well, Natalie, thanks for having me on. And I think when a lot of people when they think of constitutional law or the Constitution, they think of the founding fathers. They think of we the people, the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. They think of James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, right? They think of the U.S. Supreme Court. They think of Justice Thomas. They think of the well. That's all true, and that is a part of constitutional law, but that's actually just half of the story of constitutional law. There's another layer of constitutional law, and it involves the states. And we have 50 states, and all of those states have their own state constitutions, 50 of them. And they're written documents. Some of them were written before the federal constitution. Some of them were written and drafted after the federal constitution. So in other words, it's this whole area of constitutional law at the state level that is very important for the current environment that we're in right now, a polarized environment that we're in. Now, state Supreme Courts, every single state has a state Supreme Court, and that state Supreme Court is supposed to interpret its state constitution impartially, objectively. It's supposed to rule on the law, and they are going to be bound by that state constitution in some way, shape, or form. What that means, however, is that there may be state Supreme Courts who make decisions that are different than how the U.S. Supreme Court would interpret the federal Constitution. And I'll give you just one example of this, and we'll get into talking about the most current issue regarding abortion. But that is, if we think back to same-sex marriage, and in 2015 in Obergefell, the U.S. Supreme Court found that there is a constitutional right to same-sex marriage in 2015. Now, prior to that decision, there were a number of state Supreme Courts that read their own state constitutions to provide a right to same-sex marriage, and that includes Massachusetts. And so there were already states that were already reading their constitutions differently than the U.S. Supreme Court. And then, of course, the Supreme Court came around and finally realized that, yes, of course, the federal Constitution does provide a right to same-sex marriage. So that's just one example of how state Supreme Courts can be on the front lines. They can be trailblazers in how we understand constitutional law and how we enjoy our own individual rights.
So when we talk about something like codifying something into a state law, does that then go into a state constitution? Because I'm hearing that word being thrown around a lot, determining whether people are going to have health care or paid family leave. So would a state Supreme Court then weigh in on that if a case came before them?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways to provide an individual right. And the first way is what we call statutory right. And that is the state legislature passes a law which says that, for example, the people of Pennsylvania have a right to access to abortion. And that would be a law that would be under the state legislation. Okay. Now, there's another way to do this, and that is that the state legislature would amend the state constitution, and they would actually write into the state constitution, there is a right to access to abortion, for example. I will note here, these are hypotheticals. This has not happened in Pennsylvania yet, okay? And then there's a third way, and this is very interesting, and this is where the state Supreme Court will interpret the Constitution to provide that right. The right may not be written in text in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court will say there's an Equal Rights Amendment. And that amendment, if we look at it from a broad perspective, that Equal Rights Amendment seems to suggest that any restriction on abortion would discriminate against women. And they would interpret the Constitution that way. So those are the three primary modes at which we can enjoy certain rights or have certain rights restricted or taken away from us. So,
and some people argue that the whole point of a Supreme Court, whether it's at the federal or the state level, is to ensure those rights, not to be restricting them. What do you think of how that works?
oh, of course. I mean, there are, and I would say more on the liberal or progressive side of the ideological perspective is that the understanding is that the state Supreme Courts should be continuously expanding rights. They should not be contracting or taking rights away. They should increasingly be reading their constitutions to allow for more individual rights. And why do we want that? Because society evolves over time, and issues related to gender identity, for example, evolve and change, and people's perspectives on those issues change. And as a result of that, state constitutions and state Supreme Courts need to be flexible and malleable, and they need to adapt to those changes. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, there are those who would say, no. In fact, what state Supreme Courts should do is that they should restrict that evolution. They should restrict that type of progress. In other words, they should read those state constitutions strictly and not to expand rights, but to contract them. And so there's those two kind of back and forth dynamics that we see, and we're seeing it play out right now as we speak throughout all the United States on the question of abortion.
So then who does the Supreme Court at either the state or the national level? Who do they work for?
Yep. The state Supreme Courts, presumably and traditionally, how we would want to understand the role of the state Supreme Courts is that we would want them to, their primary job is to interpret the state constitution and uphold the rule of law. Now, the reality is, and that many state Supreme Courts, they are elected. And in many ways, people believe that those state Supreme Court justices, they should be working on behalf of the people. And that is a bit of a clash, because you don't want jurists and judges to be influenced by politics. You want them to be objective in how they go about making their rulings. And so I think from a more theoretical standpoint, we would want our judges to say, I am bound by the state constitution, I am bound by the rule of law, and I need to make these decisions objectively. However, in reality, we do have a lot of state Supreme Court justices who are influenced and arguably are working on behalf of the people of a commonwealth or a state.
Yeah, I think you could tell I didn't have a very good poker face when you were talking about that word objective, because we are dealing with so much activism on the courts right now. So before we go into sort of the dare to care aspect of this in what's happening with the PA Supreme Court race, which is a big deal, I just wanted to read a quote to you. You do a lot of writing around the city and region on these very topics. And I've seen this quote that you provided on a few of your pieces, and I thought he must really like this one. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah.
You said nearly a century ago, Justice Louis D. Brandeis' dissent in New State Ice Co. versus Liebman coined one of the most profound statements in American law. It is of the happy incidence of the federal system that a single courageous state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. What could this mean when we're talking about this idea of expansion or contraction of rights?
Yes. Well, Justice Louis Brandeis is one of my favorite Supreme Court justices. He was one of the first Jewish justices on the Supreme Court. And so I believe he was one of, if not the greatest Supreme Court justice that we've had in this country. And what he was saying in that quote, and it was in a dissenting opinion, he was the only dissenting justice in that opinion. But what he was effectively saying is that, look, where the federal government is overreaching, or where federal courts might be overreaching, it's okay for a state to go out on its own, whether it be a state legislature or a state court, and to experiment, to try something different, and to do so without risking it affecting the rest of the country. Now, what he sort of means by this is when the federal government, when Congress passes a piece of legislation, oftentimes it affects the entire nation. When the president out of the White House makes a decision, it may affect the entire nation. Or when the Supreme Court makes a ruling like overturning Roe v. Wade, it affects the entire nation. Whereas what Brandeis is saying is that at the state level, state legislatures should feel free to deviate, and they should feel free to try new things. And really, we do see that in many instances. We have state Supreme Court justices who say, we're going to read our Constitution differently than how the U.S. Supreme Court has. Or we have states who say, we are going to pass a piece of legislation that is perhaps very different than what Congress has passed in recent memory. And so really, he's trying to get the states to realize they can do more, and that our system of government, federalism, embraces and facilitates and encourages that type of experimentation.
That's so interesting to me. And I think that's why I really wanted to get people to care about this topic, because in the spirit of that, we have a very heated race happening here at the state level for the Supreme Court. And for people that may not know, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has a huge race with national implications, especially for reproductive rights. We have Republican Caroline Carluccio, who is being backed by GOP billionaire Jeff Yass, and Democrat Dan McCaffrey, who has been raking in donations and endorsements from reproductive rights organizations. So can we talk a little bit about whoever is elected in this particular election, how that could tip the balance or the scales as it pertains to abortion rights? Because as of right now, abortion is legal in Pennsylvania up until 24 weeks, but the Supreme Court is currently weighing a case involving Medicaid coverage for abortion, which of course could impact then how abortion is provided in the state of Pennsylvania moving forward. So can you weigh in on the importance of this election from your perspective?
Yeah, this is extremely important election. And just to take a step back on how we got here, why are we having an election so important here in 2023 for the state Supreme Court? Well, a year ago, Justice Max Baer, who was a Democrat, passed away in office. And that doesn't happen very often. And as a result of that, there's a vacancy. There's a seat that needs to be filled. Now, when Max Baer was on the bench, the Democrats had a majority 5-2. There was 5 democratically elected justices, and there were 2 Republican. Now, with Max Baer having passed away, it's a 4-2 split. And the state of Pennsylvania is required to fill that seat. And as a result, we now have an election. Now, when there is a seat that's open, that election is partisan, meaning that the candidates run as a Democrat or Republican or any other party that might be involved, and they can take massive amounts of money, contributions from committees and from political influenced lobbying to run for this seat. And once they get onto the bench, they have 10 years. They have 10 years to be on that bench. And then after those 10 years, they have a retention election. And a retention election is simply voters saying yes to retain or no to get that person off the bench. And I will say historically, that very rarely happens. But in this circumstance with McCaffrey and Carluccio, this is a partisan election, a Republican and a Democrat vying for that one seat. Now, if the Republicans win that seat, we have a 4-3 split. And Democrats still will hold a majority. And it's a narrow majority, but it's still a majority. If the Democrats win the seat, they go back to a 5-2, and that is even stronger majority. Why is this important in this era at this very moment? Well, because as you mentioned, Natalie, there is a case before the state Supreme Court on the question of abortion access in Medicaid. And right now, under Pennsylvania law, Medicaid will not reimburse. They will not reimburse those who have sought an abortion, that abortion access. They will not reimburse individuals for that. And there are groups.
For any reason?
Well, unless of course there are exceptions, and that is with regards to rape and a number of other kind of exceptions to that rule. But for the most part, it cuts off a significant number of Pennsylvanians from accessing that type of reimbursement. And what groups have said who are challenging this law is that that is a violation. It's discriminatory, and it's in violation of the Equal Rights Amendment of the state constitution. In other words, it discriminates against women. Why? Because women, on par, for the most part, are the ones who are going to be affected by this policy, and that is unconstitutional. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, this is an opportunity, possibly, for the state Supreme Court to effectively decide whether or not the Pennsylvania state constitution provides a protection to abortion under the state constitution.
Wow.
Yes.
Whew, that just gives me pause. I had to just take that breath because this to me is such an incredibly important election. However you're feeling on this topic, this is why we need to be voting in sort of these off-year elections. So as we wrap up this Dare to Care, can you just reiterate the need for people to get out and vote for these local and state elections and why it is necessary for a functioning democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, since 2020, in many ways, our election systems have been under attack. The integrity of our elections have been under attack. We dealt with an onslaught of challenges to free elections, free and fair elections back in 2020. And that's not going away. And what we learned from the 2020 presidential election was that state courts played a significant role in upholding the rule of law and pushing back on anti-democratic state legislatures that were trying to undermine democracy. State courts, not necessarily federal courts. There were some federal courts doing that, but state courts were central to really keeping democracy intact. And so as we are now in a position to elect and to vote on state court judges, I oftentimes will write, and I'll speak about this on the news, that we should be very much focused on state and local elections when it deals with judges, because those judges are inevitably going to have to make very, very important decisions on everything from gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, to abortion rights, to criminal justice reform. Many of these issues that affect you, they affect me, they affect our children, they affect our families, they affect everyone. And when you look at it from that perspective, and you look at the ability of Pennsylvanians to vote, right? Pennsylvanians can vote in judicial elections. That's not every American throughout the country can vote in a judicial election. This is very much, Pennsylvania is only one of 7 states that allow for partisan elections for judges. And so as a result of that, it's a right worth cherishing. It's a right worth keeping in mind, and it's a right that's worth exercising here coming up in November. So.
Jerry, thank you so much for daring to care with me about these topics. And
Sure.
Speaking of, your speaking engagements, you can also check out every other week. Jerry and I go back to basics talking about constitutional law on KDKA radio, and they are always such enlightening conversations. So thank you for your time and your expertise.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate being on. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining me for this month's Dare to Care. Do you have an issue that's near and dear to your heart that you want more people to care about? Let's connect. Find me on social media at Natalie Bencivenga, or you can email me at admin@nataliebencivenga.com. I dare you.